Tonight on Stay Tuned, we are taking on a topic that has brought a lot of national attention to Missouri, and some would say for all the wrong reasons. We are talking about the death penalty. So stay tuned.
And on Stay Tuned, you drive the discussion. We bring local experts, journalists, and civic leaders together to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Tweet us your insights on tonight's topic, and you've got a seat at the table. With a few national experts and a panel of community members, this is the show bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. So stay tuned.
So tonight's show is timely. Just yesterday, the state executed its fifth inmate in the past 5 months, and the two gentlemen at the table, as I as well, were all there covering it in Bonne Terre, different aspects of the story. But before I ask the two of you for your perspectives, the producer of this show, Margie Enright, was also in Bonne Terre, and she filed this report.
Hours before Jeffrey Ferguson was scheduled to be put to death by lethal injection on Wednesday, demonstrators were holding vigil, while reporters are on the scene. For both proponents and detractors of capital punishment, the questions are many. Some have remained the same over the years. What's fair? What's constitutional? What's moral? And of course, what's cruel and unusual? But at the site of Ferguson's pending execution, some of the newer questions, recently brought to light by St. Louis Public Radio reporter Chris McDaniel, linger in the press room. Where are tonight's execution drugs coming from? Were they obtained legally? Will there be a stay of Ferguson's execution? Journalists gather in this room waiting for news as Jeffrey Ferguson's life hangs in the balance. When covering an execution, it's often more of a waiting game than anything else. But for some, these hours are nothing compared to the 25 years that have passed since that night.
And what Ferguson did, he abducted a 17-year-old kid, a young girl she's working a night job while she's going to school, abducted her, did unspeakable things to her in the dead of winter, and then slowly strangled her and killed her, and then dumped her body, her unclothed body, in a field and left her there. I mean, he absolutely earned it. We're not throwing darts at boards and deciding who gets sentenced to death and who doesn't.
In these final hours, appeals are still being considered and denied.
There's still obviously a trial over the constitutionality of Missouri's methods. For the previous execution, 3 Supreme Court justices, 3 out of 9, said that they would grant a stay. They voted for a stay. For this specific one, 4 out of the 9 justices voted for a stay.
Is it surprising?
It does surprise me because there aren't really many different circumstances between this case and the previous one.
But even with one more vote, it's still a minority, and so the execution order stands.
I'm sure your levels are all right.
Ferguson is pronounced dead at 12:11 a.m.
The offender has died.
The state's witnesses to the execution, including several journalists, file in along with the victim's family.
I have no idea how she felt. I'm sure none of you out here know how she felt, but she had to first and foremost feel the fear. The man that just died because of this, he felt an iota of the fear she felt.
There are still uncertainties and questions much bigger than this particular case.
The previous one, I'm not asking for their identity, of course. I'm just asking, was it the same pharmacy as last time?
We won't get into that, but everything proceeded in a constitutional, lawful manner following the protocol.
And as the executions continue to play out with increasing frequency, so do the questions. For Stay Tuned, I'm Margaret Enright.
Thanks, Margie. Let's introduce who's at the table, who you just saw there in that piece in the background and in the foreground, if you will. Bill McClellan, St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist, and Donnybroker here at the 9 Network. Thanks for coming over to the show tonight, Bill. And Chris McDaniel, St. Louis Public Radio. Bill, I'll start with you. What takes the columnist to an execution?
Well, I was a state's witness. This was the third execution I've witnessed. And I knew so many people involved in the case. You know, Jeffrey's father was a photographer at the newspaper, so he was a friend of mine. And consequently, I followed the case very closely and got to know Jim Hall and Susan King,
The victim's parents.
Kelly's parents, and followed the case, you know, all through the years. And about a year ago, when it looked like we were stopping executions, I did a couple of columns on what seemed to be a de facto moratorium, and went to the prison and talked to Jeffrey about his thoughts, and talked to Jim and Susan about their thoughts, and then we kicked back into the execution mode. So I felt like this is one I should be there for.
Did you see their views, I'm thinking of the victim's parents, evolve or change or how, over time? It's 25 years.
A little bit. I mean, it's been 25 years. Susan seemed to stay the most firm from the very beginning, 25 years ago to now. And Jim left religion and then gained religion, but he also was firm in believing that the death penalty was warranted and had been given and should be carried out. I mean, neither of them had any doubts about this.
And Jeffrey Ferguson, you mentioned religion, had gained religion himself, I understand, in his time in prison.
Well, yes, I think Jeffrey did, and you know, of course, he's a different person 25 years after the crime, you know, when he's no longer drinking and doing drugs.
You said this is your third time as a state's witness?
Yes.
What is that like, having not done that myself? And most people at home will never experience anything like that.
Well, the Department of Corrections does these things with as much dignity as it can muster. I mean, these are somber affairs. There's no horseplay. But they're almost anticlimactic. I mean, the people get the drugs, and it is as if they go to sleep. I mean, when it used to be the 3-drug cocktail, there was a moment when the condemned person would cough and then die. Yesterday, I almost couldn't see anything as far as Jeffrey. There seemed to be no discomfort. He was facing his family and friends. You know, there's 3 viewing areas. The state's witnesses and the condemned person's families are on either side, and the victims' families are invisible to the rest of us at the foot, looking at the condemned person. So when the curtains open, the state's witnesses see the family and friends of the condemned person. But there's no, except for that emotional level, seeing the family and friends of the condemned, it isn't like the condemned person writhes or anything. He just seems to go to sleep.
Does it do anything to you? Have you changed? I think it's fair to ask the reporter who's a columnist, who's not afraid to give his opinion. I mean, have you changed over the years at all, or have witnessing these affected you?
I've always been ambivalent about the death penalty, and I still am. You know, but I feel that as long as the state is going to have the death penalty, people like me who are ambivalent should be there. I mean, there should be witnesses who aren't completely for it or completely against it.
Chris, have you ever witnessed one yourself?
I filed the paperwork at the end of last year, beginning of this year, to be a state's witness, but I have not been selected, and ultimately that's the discretion of the director of the Department of Corrections.
And you've covered it, at least the last couple I know. How many have you covered from Bonne Terre?
Well, specifically from Bonne Terre, I've covered the previous 3, but I've been covering this since early October is really when I've been covering this.
And since most of us only know, Bill just gave us a pretty good picture there, but you know, maybe logistically, what is it like covering this? Nothing like the movies, as you just saw from that kind of sterile press room there.
Well, it really depends. On a lot of things. I mean, it depends on, if there are stays or not, or if it's still making its way through the courts. For the previous two, there were no stays, so it took place near midnight, which is when it's scheduled to. But for some of the other ones, they've taken place at 10 o'clock, meaning that there's a stay in place for most of the day. So most of the day you're waiting around.
I'm thinking of any barriers. Do you run into anything as a journalist in that regard?
Well, most of my reporting has been about the lengths that the state has gone to in terms of how it obtains the lethal injection drugs, how it knows that they're of a certain quality. And that's certainly been difficult because the state maintains that this is something that it has to maintain confidential. They even say that we could be prosecuted for publishing the identity of the people. So there are many roadblocks in that.
Because I ask, because we heard it a little bit in Margie's piece, but having been there twice when you were there, I know you ask a lot of questions that you're probably not going to get an answer to. And to be fair to you, at this moment, we're going to hear more about the drugs as we go out throughout the night, too.
Sure. Well, I won't get a lot of answers to the questions that I have because they pertain to the drug quality and the drug supplier. And unfortunately, the people who can answer those questions aren't at the podium. There are only really a few people at the Department of Corrections who can answer questions about the drug's quality and the drug supplier, and that would be the Director of the Department of Corrections and the Director of Adult Institutions, David Dormeyer. But as you saw earlier, George Lombardi only reads a statement and then he leaves. So there really no opportunity to get those questions.
All right, let's get up to date with more of what you're talking about. Yes. We asked Chris, he's helped us a lot. He's broken a lot of ground on this issue, and also we've leaned on him pretty hard for this episode. So we ask you to kind of get us up to speed with the piece tonight. Let's take a look at that so we'll know more of what you're talking about.
Since November, Missouri officials have tried to hide where they're getting their execution drugs. This redacted license was key in a St. Louis public radio investigation that revealed the state was resorting to an out-of-state pharmacy that wasn't licensed to sell in Missouri. Under normal circumstances, a pharmacy selling its drugs without a license in the state could be committing a felony. In his deposition shown here, a high-ranking corrections official testified that he was actually driving across state lines with more than $11,000 to pay the pharmacy, all in cash. This revelation led to a lawsuit in which that pharmacy agreed to not sell for at least one of Missouri's executions. That's when the state said they'd found another willing pharmacy. So far, little is known about this new supplier. It led a federal judge to declare that, based on the minimal information the state has provided, it could be that Missouri is relying on nothing more than a high school chemistry class. The state has now carried out 2 executions, that of inmate Michael Taylor and Jeffrey Ferguson, since it's found its new supplier.
And I want to mention, too, we want your voice, your thoughts, your insights in tonight's conversation. So find us with hashtag StayTunedSTL. Okay, Chris, so we're talking a lot about injection drugs. And I guess, too, I just want to set up that these are kind of separate issues. I mean, I've seen you there covering this. There are very emotional issues. We're going to hear more from the county prosecutor later. Mm-hmm. We're going to debate different issues. But specifically, your reporting has been, is it fair to say, more about the way the state does its business?
My reporting has mostly been about the state's actions. It's looking at it more from sort of a macro level, saying the state's, obviously drastically increased the number of people that it's been executing, the rate that it's been doing it, and looking at, the lengths that it goes to, specifically in obtaining the drug, which has been a problem for not only Missouri, but a lot of other states.
Okay, let's start there then. Why is that? Why has it been hard for Missouri to get its hands on this one single drug, which is?
Pentobarbital. The problem is that virtually no drug manufacturer wants its products to be used in lethal injection, either for moral reasons or for public relations reasons. As a result of that, you have a lot of states, or at least several of them that are carrying out the death penalty still, turning to things called compounding pharmacies. Compounding pharmacies aren't like drug manufacturers. They aren't regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. They're instead regulated by state boards of pharmacy. And the drugs that they make have a significantly higher failure rate, which is problematic because obviously the drug has to be of a certain quality if you're going to use it to carry out an execution, or it could go wrong.
You want it to work.
Right.
And there's no way to test it, I guess.
And the quality of the drug really varies from batch to batch. And many would argue that it's very contingent upon the identity of the supplier.
You want to know who's supplying it because they have a track record?
If they have a track record of making shoddy products, or if they maybe aren't licensed. And in fact, as we mentioned earlier, we had an investigation at the end of December where we found out that Missouri's drug supplier was not licensed in the state of Missouri.
But before we get into that, I want to know the state has its reasons for not wanting you to know or anyone to know where they're getting these drugs.
Well, the state contends that if the identity of the supplier were to get out, that the supplier wouldn't want to sell for executions. It's why states go to such great lengths to keep them secret. It's why a high-ranking corrections official is, driving to Oklahoma, or was driving to Oklahoma with $11,000 in cash.
To buy the drugs.
To buy the drugs. So there are a few different reasons. I mean, one, the state says that it's unpopular for this supplier to get out, if their identity were to get out. And the other reason, they cite safety concerns. But
the same reason that the curtains are pulled, as Bill is describing, and you don't see who's carrying things out in the room.
Right. And, Missouri does have statute that protects the members of the execution team who are directly carrying out the execution. The state expanded that definition in October to try to include the people who are supplying it. That's something that's very much contentious and not at all settled in the courts right now.
Okay, so you still found out who we believe was supplying this. What did you find out?
So, yeah, we were able to find out ultimately because the Department of Corrections made a mistake. They gave out more documents. They didn't redact everything that they should have. We found out that the supplier was an Oklahoma compounding pharmacy that wasn't licensed in the state of Missouri. We also found out that this pharmacy had been cited in the past for increasing the dosages of drugs and ordering pharmacists to shred the prescriptions. We had also found out that they had been cited in the past for creating a copy of an FDA-approved drug, which compounding pharmacies are not supposed to do, and there's a law against it. So there were some problems with this pharmacy. We reported their identity, and then a few weeks later, an inmate who was on death row sued that pharmacy. They went to court, but they reached a settlement that was out of court. So we ultimately don't know the exact terms of that settlement.
So are they still supplying? This has been out there prior to yesterday's
Sure.
execution.
So in February, they reached a settlement, the terms of which were confidential. But from everything that I've been told, they agreed to not sell for that specific inmate's execution. Nothing I've read seems to indicate that they've agreed to not sell for any of Missouri's future executions or for other states, for that matter.
So Missouri's had to go elsewhere?
Yes. In February, the state said that they'd found another willing pharmacy. And ultimately, at this point, we don't know anything about this pharmacy. I've asked several times to see the license, to no avail.
Okay, there are a few other elements to this in terms of objections people are raising. There is the idea that while the appeals process, we've seen this play out in the last few executions, goes through the Supreme Court, there are somehow other appeals still perhaps undecided when the person is put to death.
Sure. So the state completely changed its execution protocol on the drugs that it was carrying out in October. So there's still a trial for the constitutionality of that method that is supposed to take place in September. So let's say I'm an inmate who's set to be executed. I would file an appeal with a district court and the federal courts. Let's say that stay is accepted, saying the method of your execution would likely be unconstitutional. At that point, the state would appeal to the circuit court. Let's say the circuit court disagrees and says that no, this execution wouldn't be unconstitutional. At that point, I would appeal to a higher court, but Missouri has shown the ability to carry out an execution before another court has weighed in and actually made that vote.
And a judge, at least one we know of, has taken issue with this. We have a clip I want to play. Can you very briefly set up what we're about to hear?
So this is Judge Riley. He's the head of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is obviously a high court, and he's speaking to an assistant attorney general, talking about their practice of carrying out executions while appeals are still pending.
And he knows the recorders are rolling, just to be clear.
He does.
And he says the following.
I might just tell you this, I'll probably regret saying this later, but I think it was the execution of Nicholson, but the state of Missouri executed somebody, which they probably had the right to do, right in the middle of our petition for rehearing voting. And I just want you to take back the word that some of the members of the court did not appreciate that we were right in the middle of voting on that.
I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good tape, as they said long before you were recording interviews, I'm sure. Where are we going next? What are you working on next? Where do you see this going?
Well, the state of Missouri seems like it's going to be continuing on with its pace of about 1 execution per month. We're still very much in the process of investigating this new pharmacy and this new supplier to see if it's licensed in the state of Missouri and if it has any citations in the past. A lot of this really depends on what the courts ultimately say about the constitutionality of the state wanting to keep secret the identity of the supplier, though.
Thank you for your impartial, very fair reporting that I've seen you in action doing. I think sometimes that gets lost on people, and you get accused from both sides of having an angle, and I know you don't. So thank you for all you've done on helping us with this show tonight. We also drew on the resources of the 9 Network here and Jim Kircher, who sat down with the county prosecutor in St. Louis County for a very unique perspective that only he can offer on the death penalty.
First of all, we look at every case.
Defense attorneys generally know that when St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCullough says he's going for the death penalty, he means it. It's not a tactic to force a plea agreement. He's already decided that under the law, the punishment fits the crime.
And so we'll look at the statute, and the statute, there's certain elements we have to prove in order to make it a murder first degree case. And the biggest one, the one that distinguishes murder first from other levels, is deliberation. We have to show that the defendant reflected coolly on the matter before he did it. This isn't it's what's commonly referred to as a cold-blooded murder as opposed to a hot-blooded murder. The fact that it's murder first degree in and of itself, doesn't mean it's a potential death case. The statute lays out a process and lays out certain aggravating circumstances that have to exist. At least one has to exist. There are about 17. And so we will go through that process of gathering as much information as we can. So ultimately then I'll meet with that group, and we'll kick it around, we'll discuss it, we'll go through everything, and then ultimately I'll make the decision as to whether we seek death or don't.
If a jury convicts, they will then decide the sentence, and they must be unanimous on the death penalty. The case will go through appeals through state and federal courts up to the Supreme Court, with Missouri's Attorney General's office arguing to uphold the conviction and the sentence. The governor does have the power to commute the sentence to reduce it to life in prison. But if there are no interventions and appeals fail, the execution is set. Still, there are often delays and new appeals up to the very end. Let me ask you about the issue that is being debated right now, and that is the method of execution, the drug protocol.
Right.
Are these legitimate issues?
No, they're distractions, and I think the people that raise those issues are anti-death penalty people. They think the death penalty is never an appropriate form of punishment under any circumstances for anybody.
And you disagree with that, obviously.
Well, I disagree with that, yes, I do. I think it's appropriate in a very limited set of cases. And there's nothing wrong with that viewpoint. That's a legitimate point. Some people that believe that it is not appropriate, and that's fine. That's a legitimate viewpoint. But the problem is this. They understand that they're not going to win that battle. They are not going to be able to get rid of the death penalty simply by saying, we disagree with it, we think it's inappropriate, we think it's wrong. So it's just a distraction to kind of get you away from what this guy actually did.
Punishment, deterrent, or both?
It's absolutely punishment, and that's the primary purpose of it. The punishment. We don't set periods of rehabilitation. We don't set periods of deterrence. We set periods of punishment, incarceration for punishment, or that. So that's the primary purpose. There are studies that go both ways to say that the death penalty is a deterrent. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's not a good reason to put somebody to death. If it deters somebody else, that's wonderful. But if it doesn't, that we're still punishing this guy for that. I can tell you this, a 25 or 15 to 20 to 25 year delay between the imposition of that sentence and carrying out that sentence, if it does have a deterrent effect, at some point it's long gone.
So deterrent or punishment, let's talk about that with our next two guests from St. Louis University's Law School. First, Sue McGraw, law professor specializing in criminal law, and you also supervise the Criminal Defense Clinic. And then working in that clinic, Grant Boyd, welcome back to the show, St. Louis University law student. Before I ask you about deterrent and punishment, we just heard the prosecutor say that this is a distraction. Are these issues that people are talking about, do you find, is this something people should care about, or is this just a distraction, do you think?
Well, this is the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees that people will not suffer when they're punished. So he might think it's a distraction, but really it's a very important constitutional matter. It's at the forefront of sentencing these days. So no, it's certainly not a distraction.
Well, go ahead, Grant, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's a matter of transparency, whether you think it's appropriate or not. As far as the death penalty, if we're going to strap somebody to the table and kill them, we should make sure we're doing it right. And that's what this is about. Make sure we're doing it right.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the research you guys have been involved with going back to deterrent or punishment. Is that evolved? Has that changed over time? I take the prosecutor at his word whatever he says, but in terms of research across the country, what have you found?
So if you look back to around the 1700s where our laws come from over in England, back then 222 crimes were eligible for the death penalty. Everything from killing someone to cutting down your neighbor's tree. But the difference was that there was no police force, no constables, nothing investigating. It was left to victims, their family and friends and neighbors to investigate crimes and then bring that forward for prosecution. So basically they were saying, we probably can't catch you ourselves, but if we do catch you, we're going to kill you. And so it might have been a deterrent back then. But then once we see at the exact same time pretty much that the Crown over in England creates a police force, they slash the amount of death penalty offenses. Which kind of correlates to the fact that if we're going to ramp up investigations and create the ability to catch you, then we no longer need as much of the death penalty.
So how has it changed in our modern era? Is it evolving now, and how is it used now?
Well, it really spiked many years ago. Then we saw a real drop-off in the number of people who were executed. And we're beginning to see those numbers go back up again as this method of execution is being, the whole matter is being settled, and states are finding different cocktails or drugs that they can use to execute people. I do want to briefly go back to deterrence because it relates to a project we're working on at our law school right now. Something can't be a deterrent if it's not used in a manner that people can expect a certain outcome. So in order for a punishment to act as a deterrent, it must be certain. And there's no real certainty as to who gets the death penalty and who doesn't. It's almost arbitrary in its application. There are some minimal standards for applying for a death penalty on a case, but those vary so much just between a county and another county, a prosecutor and another prosecutor.
I thought our laws are supposed to do away with a lot of that discretion.
Right.
They're 40 some odd years ago.
This is really an area where discretion determines whether someone gets life or death. You saw Bob McCullough. His office is very active in seeking the death penalty. Right next to St. Louis County is St. Louis City, where Jennifer Joyce hardly ever requests the death penalty on a case. These are two cities that abut each other, but are complete opposite when it comes to seeking the death penalty for criminal defendants.
Are states starting to pull this off the table? I know in Illinois we no longer have a death penalty.
Yeah. The states are starting to pull it off the table because they're starting to realize that we're getting it wrong. And when you're talking about the death penalty, it's the one judgment that once you kill somebody and execute them, we can't go back. There's no saying, oops, we're sorry. So they're pulling it off the table because they realize that they're wrong. I mean, since 1976, we've had 144 exonerations from death row, 3 from Missouri. I mean, that's 3 too many and 144 too many. You can't have the margin of error.
I know a lot of people would point out there are a lot of appeals. I know the family, for instance, I would never try to speak for them. The Halls, who were down there just over 24 hours ago, spent 25 years waiting for what they felt was justice. 25 years isn't enough time to figure out these problems and any possible sentencing?
Well, I mean, that is the problem. There were problems. That's why it took so long. You know, when you have a death penalty appeal, it costs at least 3 times as much as a regular death penalty case. The appeals drag out for a long time because they need to, because if we're going to execute somebody, we need to be absolutely certain that the fairest measure of justice was given, that there weren't mistakes with the evidence, that there was a full investigation. If you were to take the death penalty off the table, if this was a case where Mr. Ferguson would have been given life without parole, this would have been over years and years ago. He still wouldn't have ever gotten out of prison, and we would have saved a lot of Missouri taxpayer money.
You've kind of touched a little bit on, and I've kind of been alluding to some of the research you've done, but at the same time, less than 24 hours ago, we also got an announcement from St. Louis University about some research you're doing. Tell me, can you kind of explain it and tell me why, and why you feel it's necessary?
Sure. We're starting a Missouri Proportionality Review Project. Over the last 20 years, the Missouri Supreme Court has been gathering data about murder-first cases and about death penalty cases. And that data has all been kept almost literally in boxes at the Missouri Supreme Court. What we want to know from looking at these records is, when was the death penalty used? When was it not used? Who got life? Who got death? There should be some consistency, Casey. We should see, you know, as we talked about, certain results when certain factors are fed in. That's the way that our justice system should work. So our projects, with the help of our students, are going to go back and say, let's look at the crime, let's look at the defendant, let's look at the evidence.
The race, the location.
Absolutely. Where do we see the consistencies we should see from a fair application of the death penalty across the state of Missouri?
Sue McGraw, Grant Boyd, thank you both for your time from St. Louis University. Speaking of data, let's go back to Jim Kircher, who has crunched a lot of data around this topic for us.
The red lever right here is the lever that would have been used to actually drop the cyanide pellets.
Missouri's gas chamber in the old state prison in Jeff City, now a stop on tours, hadn't been used since the late 1960s. That's when Missouri switched to lethal injections. It was also a time when public support for the death penalty in the United States was at an all-time low, and the country saw some of the first significant legal challenges to capital punishment. In 1972, the Supreme Court declared the death penalty, as it was being applied then, cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, effectively voiding 40 death penalty laws and more than 600 sentences. But the court left the door open for states to rewrite their death penalty laws, and several did, with new guidelines for judges and juries limiting their discretion in sentencing. By 1977, the death penalty was legal again. For a variety of reasons, 18 states, including Illinois, have abolished the death penalty, leaving 32 states with capital punishment on the books, but not all death penalty states use it equally. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty, Missouri has carried out 73 executions and has 47 inmates on death row. In comparison, Texas has carried out 511 executions with 292 death row inmates, while Colorado has executed 1 person and has 4 on death row. But once you take population into consideration, Missouri ranks 5th in executions per capita. A closer look is by county. Counties concentrated in 4 states round out the top 15 in executions, with St. Louis County and St. Louis City with the 9th and 10th most executions, respectively, since 1976. The state of Missouri has carried out more executions in the past 6 months than it carried out in the preceding 7 years. Missouri's record for executions in 1 year is 9, and that's a number the state is on target to exceed if 2014 continues at the current rate.
We're joined now by two attorneys who work on behalf of death row inmates from Sindel, and Noble. Kay Parrish, thanks for being here, and Rick Sindel. Sorry to mispronounce your last name there. I apologize.
All right. Everybody does it.
Well, and Rick, I believe you tried the first death penalty case back when we reinstated the death penalty in 1978, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct. It was a kidnapping murder case. It was because of the amount of publicity. It was moved from St. Louis to Kansas City. I've been out of law school 3 years, and it was up to me to learn everything I could about capital jurisprudence, which was a lot to learn. We ended up trying it in Kansas City.
So give us some perspective on what's going on here. We just heard Jim say in 6 months more execution than the past 7 years, even a little more than that, I think. And now we're on pace, if that's a word you can even use in a conversation like this, to break a record, if you can use that word, for executions in a year. Is this just because we have a backlog of some kind, or have we increased our rate in some other way?
I think it's because of the backlog. There was a pretty significant period of time where the lethal injection issue with the 3-drug cocktail was being litigated, and that took quite a bit of time to litigate, and then the Department of Corrections just sort of, boom, changed the entire format of how they were going to do the executions, which has resulted in additional lethal injection litigation that's still ongoing. So, but during that period of time, no one was being brought up for execution. The Missouri Supreme Court was not issuing warrants for execution, and then I think probably with a change of the personnel in the court, plus the fact that litigation is no longer viable, I think that's the reason you're seeing so many quick and consistent executions.
Some people may wonder if they're in a hurry, if they think perhaps there's a window and things may change in terms of the legality.
There's no question about it, because I think that what you find is as Chris McDaniels commented, the amount of secrecy and the lack of transparency that's going around along the issue of how these drugs are obtained, how they're secured, bagmen crossing state lines with bags full of cash. That's because they know that eventually this will become a big problem. That's the reason for the secrecy.
Kay, is this just a distraction like the prosecutor was saying?
I mean, if you think following the law is a distraction, no, I don't think it's a distraction at all. I think that if anybody ought to be accountable for following the law, it should be the government. And what we're finding, Sue McGraw had mentioned it's an issue of the 8th Amendment. It's not just the 8th Amendment that's being violated here. We absolutely know that there are provisions of the Food and Drug Act that are being violated here. There's a number of due process issues, equal protection issues. So certainly this is not a distraction. There are real issues here in terms of the fact that our state is absolutely violating the law in executing people. And I hope that the people of the state don't see that just as a distraction.
This is the law of our land. I mean, are the state's hands not tied to some degree when it comes to they have what they see as valid reasons for some level of secrecy around how they do this? And then our Supreme Court has not said that this is a violation of the cruel and unusual punishment.
Well, first of all, cruel and unusual punishment is not the only issue in terms of the legal violations. Our Supreme Court has not said that, but we haven't been given the opportunity to adequately litigate these issues because we haven't been given access to the information that we need in order to litigate these issues. This veil of secrecy is a cloak that insulates them from any kind of real review in terms of what is going on. And so that's all the veil of secrecy is. It insulates them. It's counter to our entire principle and system of checks and balances within our government, because there is no check on the DOC right now. They're keeping things secret and nobody knows what's going on, and therefore it makes it impossible for us to even find out whether the law is really being violated or not.
Do you see anything changing on that? I mean, is there a way that you, defending someone on death row, could have access to the information you need to prepare an adequate defense, and that doesn't necessarily have to be public information at the same time?
Well, I think there is a little bit of a trend actually in the last 2 days. These secrecy issues are not unique to Missouri. It's a little bit ironic the way it's happening within the country, that Department of Corrections as a whole, there's been a trend toward covering up this information in terms of the suppliers of drugs and things like that. At the same time, Department of Corrections are trying to rely on less reliable sources for the drugs. So it's kind of a time when we need to know this information more than ever. But 2 courts in the last 2 days have ruled that it's a violation of due process, that it's not giving inmates access to the courts, and therefore it's a violation of due process to continue to withhold this information. And they've ruled that under the United States Constitution. So I think that Missouri courts are going to need to be looking very closely at these issues, and ultimately, I hope it's a issue that the Supreme Court may decide as well.
In fact, in Oklahoma, where the Department of Corrections from Missouri was sending their bag man with the cash in hand to buy the drugs from the apothecary shop, which Chris McDaniels discussed, a judge in that particular state said, this is it, you cannot execute anyone, we're stopping them because you're violating their due process and access to the courts. Anybody who looks at the legal record on the case of the lethal injection will be convinced that the Attorney General and the Department of Corrections have done nothing but try to obstruct and stonewall and stop a legitimate inquiry into what is these processes and procedures.
Let's maybe close with your long view here, and maybe, and this is open to both of you, of course.
She'll interrupt me if she wants.
That's perfectly fine. What have you seen in terms of how this issue has evolved over the years you've been dealing with it, and maybe where do you see it going?
I'm going to let Kay talk about the lethal injection, but what I see as the trend in capital punishment, when I first started doing capital punishment it's a long time ago, and there was a big push towards it. I don't think that there's a big push towards it at this point in time. I think that the populace is now believing that the death penalty doesn't work. The exonerations that have occurred, that Grant mentioned, 144 exonerations, those are convincing people that this system may not work. And I just think that the death penalty is not on the rise in terms of popularity. You're finding more and more states imposing moratoriums, and you're finding more and more governors and legislators re-examining and re-evaluating whether it's worth it. As Sue McGraw said, this stuff costs at least 3 times. California spent $4 billion since 1978 on death penalty litigation. That's crazy.
We'll leave it there. Kay, stick around for the post show, if you know, which we put on the show, so you don't have to wait too long.
Great.
But we want, because I say that because we want to hear what you are saying at home via hashtag Stay Tuned STL. Well, as we were working on tonight's show, just about every guest we called recommended we talk to this guest we're about to hear from via Google Hangout. So we did just that. Richard Dieter with the Death Penalty Info Center, coming to us from Silver Springs, Maryland. Richard, thank you for being here. We appreciate your time and a lot of the data that you have compiled that we're able to draw on. I guess let's pick up right where we just left off in the last conversation. Public opinion, is that truly changing? I believe I've seen Gallup polls where the death penalty was the least popular back in the middle of the last century. Where are we now?
Well, actually, we're at a 40-year low in terms of public support for the death penalty. So, since 1972, in the Gallup poll, although it's still a support for the death penalty in theory, I think what's really changed is that there's now a sentence of life without parole. And so when Gallup has asked that question, the public's about evenly split, about 48% each.
So what are other? So what are you seeing in other states? We talked exclusively about Missouri almost so far. What are you seeing elsewhere?
I think it's correct what I heard earlier, that actually the death penalty is being used a lot less compared to the 1990s. And that's true in Missouri, it's true around the country, it's true in Texas. A 75% drop in death sentences. There were 80 last year. Back in the 90s, there were 300 a year. Same with executions, they're down about 50%. Death row is smaller. And now we've had 6 states in the past 6 years abolish the death penalty. So that's added to the number of states without the capital punishment. And that's a big change, because nothing was changing in that area for many years. And now states like New Hampshire are getting ready to vote on it this year, too.
You know, Texas seems to get a lot of the press when you're talking about states with the death penalty, but we've seen Missouri at the top of several different lists. Can you help us make sense of some of the data around Missouri? Or should we be thinking of ourselves more like Texas?
Well, to begin with, there was a time when Missouri wasn't having many executions. I think when it readopted the death penalty, it still took until 1989 before its first execution. So cases were building up, as was pointed out. The people who are being executed today in Missouri, and there's been 5 in the past 5 months, are from cases of 20 years ago. Currently, Missouri is only sentencing about 2 people a year to death. So if you're only sentencing a couple people a year to death, you're not going to have 10 executions a year later on. So I think what we have is this historical shift here. Death sentences are down in Missouri, but executions are from older cases. And of course, that's true. Texas is having more executions than death sentences. That will change.
Okay, so looking at trends like that, look into your crystal ball for us. What do you see happening?
Well, the death penalty was carried out in only 9 of our 50 states last year. So it's a dwindling or perhaps less relevant punishment than it used to be. But that doesn't get rid of it completely. I mean, states like Missouri, states like Texas and Florida are not going to abolish it. Where it hits the crooks is when the Supreme Court looks at it and says, this is becoming so unusual, so rare, as to be outside of our standards of decency. I don't think that's going to happen, anytime soon. But if we get to a majority of states, as 18 states have abolished it, 3 states in the West have declared a moratorium, more states are voting this year to abolish it. If we get to the point where most of our states don't have it, and even those that have it hardly use it, the question then will arise: is it now cruel and unusual, even though a few states are carrying it out?
Richard Dieter with the Death Penalty Info Center, thank you so much for joining us from Silver Springs, Maryland. We appreciate your time and the resource that you've been.
Thank you.
We're actually going to stay here at the Google Hangout. We're going to talk about our next door neighbors. In the meantime, I will explain before we do that what I said just a minute ago about the post show. We have the post show really on the show for most of it. It bleeds over online to staytuned.9net.org, but we like to start it on the show to give you a flavor of that. And that's what the gang is doing over there. The rest of our guests will be getting back together at the table. We'll see them in just a minute. But before we go back to the table, let's go back to the Hangout and let's cross the river and go back to Amanda Vinicky. Welcome back to the show, Amanda Vinicky from Illinois Public Radio, live from Springfield, Illinois. Thanks for coming back. Regular on Stay Tuned.
No problem. Hey there, Casey.
I think maybe I'm going to ask you about something you don't cover much anymore. Is that fair? Tell us about the death penalty in Illinois. When's the last time you did a death penalty story?
Back in 2011 would be my guess. I didn't actually check back, so who knows, because there's been a little bit of follow-up, but that's when Illinois did abolish the death penalty. Governor Pat Quinn signed that into law. It just barely got through the General Assembly, but and he spent a long time before he actually gave his signature, did a lot of research, and spoke with advocates and opponents, so really people on both sides, before he said what was his most difficult decision as Illinois' governor.
Yeah, I remember there was a time there where we didn't think Illinois would have the death penalty any longer, but there were still some high-profile capital cases being tried, and attorneys deciding whether to go ahead and proceed with the death penalty and things of that nature. So I do remember that time, but then he did eventually sign it. What?
And commuted all of the sentences of the individuals that were still on death row. So it was actually not since 1999 was the last time there was an execution in this state.
So why is that? What do you think caused the end of the death penalty in Illinois?
There's a whole lot there, and some of it precedes my time. That goes back to when George Ryan was governor, and there was a case of an individual who'd come within 48 hours. He'd had, his last meal, for example, and then ended up, being clear. And that got a ton of attention. It was one of many high-profile cases, but that one, I think, was really the turning point. And at that point in time, George Ryan ended up commuting all of the sentences, put a freeze, moratorium on the death penalty. And so it was after that point in time that you saw commissions, studies, legislators looked at that. The moratorium really held for past Ryan's tenure. Blagojevich left it in place. And then it wasn't until, again, about a decade after it had been studied that Illinois actually went forward and passed that law. There wasn't one signature event that put anything over the cliff in terms of Illinois changing, but a well-funded lobbying effort, and it seems to have contributed to it. The State Bar Association, for example, took a vote to recommend Illinois doing away with it. It was less that it was immoral, more that it was seen, at least in the eyes of Governor Quinn, as an arbitrary system, and one that was, if not error-ridden, at least error-prone, and systematically so.
All right, Amanda, I'll have to leave it there because I've already promised the post-show on the show, and we're gonna try to get to it. But thanks, as always, for bringing your Illinois perspective to the show. We appreciate your time.
Anytime, thank you.
Amanda Vinicky, Illinois Public Radio. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back to the table as we said we would. Okay, so I want to ask you guys something that really stuck with me. I didn't get to ask you, Chris, at the very beginning, but and then I want to ask everyone, is why should we care about, specifically on the drug issue, the way our state is doing things right now? I mean, I keep going back to it, but maybe because he's not here to say it again himself, but Bob McCullough said this is just a distraction.
Well, from my standpoint, I mean, you know, I cover state government, so it's kind of my job to make sure that the people who are involved in doing this are following the law. So that's certainly a reason. The other reason is that, you know, the Constitution protects against cruel and unusual punishment. As Kay mentioned earlier, though, it's not just about the Eighth Amendment.
Bill, you said you're ambivalent about the death penalty. Are you ambivalent about the way it's carried out?
Yes, you know, I was interested to see if this new method created any great discomfort or if there was any apparent pain. And if there was, I certainly didn't see it. I mean, the operation went smoothly.
I mean, maybe there's no good way if you're going to have a death penalty. Is it possible to have a good way to do it?
I want to comment on that a little bit. You know, you mentioned why should we care. I think the reason we should care is because every time the state of Missouri executes a person, they're doing it in the name of every citizen of the state of Missouri. So I care. I care what my government is doing. I think we should care because we claim to be an open and democratic society, and this is something we're doing. The state is doing in the name of every citizen, and nobody knows how it's happening. No one knows what it's doing, and I think we should care because I think that the government should be accountable to following the law and should be following the law, and we know they're not in this case, at least with regard to violating the Food and Drug Act. So I think that's in terms of the question of why we should care. The other question you just asked, though, is also related to that. Can you repeat it?
No, because I think I've come up with a better one.
Yeah.
No, well, in all seriousness, I do want to ask this question before we run out of time, and that is, why did we move to lethal injection in the first place, do you think? Was that?
Well, I think that there was a, you know, kind of a growing concern within the nation about how executions were carried out. There was lethal gas that was oftentimes used for electrocution, which had people bleeding from their eyeballs and all kinds of really horrible things. And there was the first execution in the post-Furman age was by a firing squad. And so I think that the state understood that this was a PR move to sort of, calm down the harsh criticism when these people were having these gruesome deaths.
So it's certainly easier on the people witnessing the execution, disregarding, how it feels or how long it takes for the person actually being executed. It's much easier in terms of the people witnessing it. It looks like a medical procedure. It's much cleaner than the methods that he just described, firing squad, gas chamber. Gas chamber is still currently on statute as something that's legal in Missouri, but we obviously don't have a gas chamber.
We've discussed the firing squad, and some have said it's more humane.
Well, it would certainly be quicker. That process.
And this is, and we're not being, we're not joking around here. You're saying because these would be trained people who know exactly what they're doing or something.
No, they're not trained. I mean, the doctor who was carrying out.
I'm talking about the idea that actual firing squad would be more humane than the however many minutes.
Well, and this is something that's been brought up by one state representative. It's a statement bill. It doesn't stand much chance, but there are some who would contend that it certainly would be better for the inmate because it's not something that's going to take, tens of minutes or 20 to 25 minutes where we really don't know, what's going on within that person's body. But on the other hand, it would certainly be much more barbaric for the people who had to witness it.
Well, on the other hand, anybody who has undergone a surgical procedure and has been put to sleep would say that that seemed, the couple times I've had it, that seemed like a painless procedure. I mean, I'd rather have that than a firing squad.
The one caveat to that would be you likely haven't been put under by compounded drugs. You've likely been put under by manufactured drugs.
I hope you're right, Chris. I like to think you are.
Well, and those same drugs, they don't want them used for the drugs you're being put under.
That's exactly right.
And one of the things that happens, and one of the concerns everyone had, was that the procedures oftentimes make the guy unable to talk or cry out or show in any way that he was in pain. And that was one of the real problems with the 3-drug cocktail. And when you have a dyslexic doctor who's really couldn't practice anywhere else, that's the one who administers the drugs. You got to be asking some questions.
Is this a state-by-state issue or more prosecutor-by-prosecutor? Is it very micro level?
I think we're looking at both. I mean, I think that certain prosecutors choose to seek the death penalty more often, as Sue talked about. In certain states, obviously, look to seek the death penalty more often. I mean, Texas is, it's almost like the Wild West down there.
Actually, a topic on St. Louis on the air today for a brief moment. A couple of things that just struck me. Bill, help me out here. Do you remember I know you remember, but when the Pope came to St. Louis in 1999, was it? Was that the first? I heard on the radio today that was the first time the Pope had ever come out against the death penalty. Did it in St. Louis? I don't know if you recall that.
Well, I don't know if it was the first time he came out against the death penalty, but he came out against a specific death penalty punishment. There was a man that was about to be executed during the Pope's visit here, and his execution was put off a couple of weeks as kind of a courtesy PR move. The Pope heard about it and appealed to Governor Carnahan to commute the sentence, and Governor Carnahan did.
Governor Carnahan actually said, he didn't know it was going to come. And the Pope came down to him after a service and just walked up to his face and said, you need to commute this. And he says, it's pretty hard to turn the Pope down.
I was working for the Archdiocese at the time, and what the Pope said that was so novel, the Catholic Church has been opposed to capital punishment for a long time, was he said the situations in which it is justified, you are justified in using the death penalty in the United States are virtually nil. You have prisons where you can lock up people 24 hours a day, keep them in solitary. You can never, they'll never come into contact with another person. They can never hurt another person again. You're never justified under those situations in using the death penalty, because in that situation, you're only using it for revenge. And revenge is not a legitimate purpose.
And Bob McCullough just said as much. He said, well, we don't really know about the deterrent effect when he spoke on this program earlier. Well, we don't really know about the deterrent effect. It can go either way. That's not the reason we do it. Well, then what is the reason? The only reason that's left is vengeance and retribution.
Punishment was the word he used.
Yes. So.
The other thing I heard on the radio today.
If you believe everything you hear on the radio.
Depends on who's talking.
Since you've been on it, I believe everything.
Is the what company this puts us in as a country? You guys
Russia, Iran, Japan, although they really don't carry them out. China.
North Korea.
It's the people that we denigrate consistently in terms of our political speech. and yet we are aligned with them in this particular punishment, which just doesn't make sense.
If you take out North Korea and China, because they don't report their statistics on executions, the U.S. was number 4 in 2013 in the number of executions by the government. And I think that's, I mean, the ones ahead of them were Iraq and Iran, which were in the hundreds. I think that's a pretty interesting company to keep.
And it creates an issue in international affairs as well. Countries in the European Union will not extradite anyone who faces the death penalty back to the United States. So if you've got a terrorism who goes to the European Union, someone who we claim to be a terrorist or anything else who goes to the European Union to seek asylum or anything else, if they are in the European Union, they won't be extradited to the United States if they face the death penalty. And that's a real issue for international relations and our ability to enforce our own laws.
You say you cover government. Give us a political lens on all of this in our state here.
I mean, you know, Governor Nixon's been in power for a while. I mean, he's been Attorney General.
I was just going to say, as the family of Kelly Hall pointed out the other day, as they expressed their gratitude to him, he was the AG when Ferguson was convicted.
No, this is a very interesting situation because after we published our story that the pharmacy that was selling the drug was not licensed in Missouri, there was a large outcry from a lot of the Democrats in the state legislature, and they've, you know, sponsored some bills that would curtail the DOC's power in this. But I mean, really, when you look at the two people who are responsible for all of this, ultimately, I mean, it's the heads of their party, which is the AG, Attorney General Chris Koster, and Governor Nixon, and they're both Democrats. In Missouri, this really isn't a Republican and Democrat issue. I looked at the numbers pretty recently, and I think, but don't hold me to this, but I think that a Democrat was likely to have a little more than 3 executions carried out during their term, and a Republican was less than 1 during their term.
You don't have to be right until you get on the radio, because then we're going to believe it.
Everything's loose on television.
Yeah, exactly. Fine. We're on the internet.
No, we're on the internet.
Please.
I'm sorry. Wow, there are no constrictions whatsoever.
Well, I don't know that we could possibly talk about this much longer and find another light moment to end on. So maybe we should leave it there. Thanks for all your time and for coming over. Bill, it was great having you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. I hope you come back.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Thanks.
you.